A man kissed his 6-week-old daughter on the forehead. Then he handed her to a stranger, walked into the dark, and never came back. Before he left, he hid something inside a motorcycle he'd built with his own hands. 19 years later, a broke, forgotten girl bought that bike for $55. She had no idea it was meant for her. She paid $55 for a rusted motorcycle. Every cent she had in the world. She thought she was buying scrap. She didn't know someone had carved her initials into the metal 19 years before she was born, and she didn't know that 76 of the most dangerous men in America were already on their way to find her, not to hurt her, to keep a promise to a ghost. She stood in the middle of a gravel lot with a wrench in her right hand and blood drying on her knuckles. Not from a fight, from work, from hours of scraping rust off metal that didn't want to let go. 76 men in leather vests stood in a wide arc around her, arms crossed, engines still ticking from the heat, chrome glinting in the late afternoon sun like rows of teeth. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them moved. The air smelled like exhaust and dust and something older, something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She held the wrench at her side knuckles white and stared at the man at the front of the line. A man built like a wall, shaved sides, dark gray hair, slicked back a beard, white as bone dust reaching his chest. Tattoos covering both arms from wrist to shoulder. Dense, dark, tribal lines and Celtic knots so thick they looked like armor etched into skin. He wore a sleeveless, black leather vest with no shirt underneath, patches stitched across the front, and a red emblem on the chest that caught the light like a warning. His hands were enormous. His expression was calm, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough to feel in her sternum. One sentence, one question. And everything she believed about herself began to collapse. But that comes later. 72 hours earlier, the girl with the wrench didn't exist yet. There was only Briar Colvin, 18 years old, alone, and invisible. The last foster family gave her 3 weeks past her birthday. Not out of kindness, out of paperwork. The state required notice, and the Dollingers were meticulous about paperwork. They filed the correct forms, gave the correct notice, and on the correct date, Mrs. Dollinger set a duffel bag by the front door at 7 in the morning and told Briar the bus stop was 2 blocks east. She didn't say goodbye. She said, "Lock the screen door on your way out." Briar locked it. She always followed the rules. 7 homes in 4 years had taught her that rules were the only thing between her and somewhere worse. You clean your plate. You don't talk back. You don't unpack your bag all the way, because unpacking means you think you're staying, and thinking you're staying is the fastest way to get moved. She learned that at 14. The Gardners in Modesto. Nice house, yellow kitchen. Mrs. Gardner made banana bread on Sundays, and for 3 months, Briar thought maybe this one was real. She put her clothes in the dresser drawers. She taped a photo of a motorcycle she'd torn from a magazine to the wall above her bed. A 1972 shovel head, black and chrome, leaning on its kickstand in front of a desert road that went nowhere and everywhere at the same time. 2 weeks later, the Gardners took in a younger kid, a boy, 7 years old with big eyes and a need that was easier to love than a 14-year-old girl who flinched when you touched her shoulder. Briar was moved to Fresno by Friday. She left the photo on the wall. She never unpacked again. By 17, the social workers stopped pretending to remember her name. They called her the Colvin file. They passed her folder across desks like a deck of cards no one wanted to hold. She had no criminal record, no behavioral flags, no medical complications. She was simply forgettable. A quiet girl who did what she was told and never caused problems and never asked for anything and therefore never received anything. She worked under the table at diners where the managers paid well and didn't ask for ID, graveyard shifts mostly. Wiping counters, refilling coffee for truckers who looked through her like she was part of the furniture. She slept in her car when she had gas money. A 2004 Civic with a cracked windshield and a heater that worked only when it wanted to. She kept the seats reclined and a blanket folded in the trunk, and she moved every few days because staying still felt like sinking, like the ground would open up and swallow her if she stopped long enough for it to notice she was there. The only thing that ever made her feel anything was the sound of motorcycles. Not cars, not trucks, motorcycles. That low, guttural rumble that started somewhere deep in the machine and rose through the asphalt and into her chest like a second heartbeat. She'd stand on the shoulder of the highway, sometimes just stand there, with her arms at her sides and let the sound wash over her as they passed. Harleys mostly, V-twins with that uneven firing rhythm, that potato-potato idle, that sounded like the engine was breathing, like it was alive. She didn't know anything about bikes, couldn't tell a carburetor from a clutch cable, didn't know what displacement meant or why some engines shook the ground harder than others. But she knew what they represented: freedom, motion, the mechanical proof that you could leave everything behind and never once look back. She wanted that. Not the bike itself, the feeling. The promise that somewhere on some road she hadn't found yet, there was a version of her life that wasn't this. She found the listing on a Thursday, a community board outside a truck stop in Elko, Nevada. The kind of board covered in index cards and torn paper, rooms for rent, dogs for sale, labor wanted. And in the bottom corner, written in black marker on a piece of cardboard, 3 lines: rusted Harley. Engine seized, $55 or best offer. Below it, a phone number. Breyer stood in front of that board for a long time. The sun was going down behind the truck stop and the air smelled like diesel and fried food and the particular kind of dust that only exists in northern Nevada, fine and pale and everywhere. She reached into her pocket and counted her money. Fives and ones, mostly, crumpled and soft from being folded too many times. $55, the exact total of everything she owned in the world. She called the number. A man answered on the second ring. His voice sounded like gravel poured through a pipe. She asked if the bike was still available. He said, yeah. She asked where. He gave her an address 12 minutes away. She drove there without thinking, because thinking would have stopped her, and stopping was the one thing she couldn't afford to do. The seller lived in a single-story house with a chain-link fence and a yard full of things that used to be something. An engine block on cinder blocks, a stack of tires turning gray in the sun, and in the far corner, leaning against a wooden fence post like a drunk man trying to stay upright, was the Harley. It was worse than she expected. The frame bent slightly to the left, the kind of warp that comes from being dropped hard and never straightened. The tank was rusted through in places, holes the size of quarters revealing the hollow cavity inside. Tires flat and cracked, chrome pitted and dull, cables frayed. The seat was split open and the foam inside had turned yellow and brittle. Most people would have walked away, called it scrap. A parts bike at best, something you strip and sell piece by piece to someone building something better. But Breyer didn't see scrap. She saw something that had been left behind, something that had been forgotten and written off and abandoned in someone's yard to rot. And she understood that feeling so deeply it made her throat tight. The seller was an older man with oil-stained hands and deep lines around his eyes. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. He took the $55, counted it once, folded it into his shirt pocket, and handed her a title that was barely legible. The whole transaction took 4 minutes. But before she left, before she finished strapping the bike to a borrowed trailer she'd talked a gas station attendant into lending her for the afternoon, the old man said something. He looked at the Harley, then at her. And his voice changed, got quieter, like he was remembering something he hadn't thought about in years. Some bikes carry more weight than metal. She didn't know what that meant. Filed it away the same way she filed away everything adults said to her. Somewhere between probably nothing and maybe something. She thanked him, climbed into the Civic, and pulled out of the driveway with the trailer rattling behind her. She found a garage to rent on the outskirts of Reno. A corrugated metal box and a row of corrugated metal boxes, the kind of place where people stored things they couldn't let go of but couldn't look at every day. The owner charged her $150 a month and didn't ask for a deposit because the lock was broken and the roof leaked in 2 places and the fluorescent light overhead buzzed like something was trapped inside it. She unloaded the Harley by herself, pushed it off the trailer and wheeled it inside and stood there looking at it under that buzzing light and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Ownership. This thing was hers, not borrowed, not temporary, not assigned by a court or a caseworker or a stranger who'd agreed to feed her in exchange for a monthly check. She had bought it with her own money. Every last dollar, and it belonged to no one's rules but her own. She started cleaning it that night. An old rag and a can of solvent she found on a shelf in the corner. She worked slowly, wiping years of grime off the fuel tank, following the curves of the metal, with her fingers feeling the shape underneath the decay. The rust came off in layers, brown, then orange, then a darker brown beneath that, like the bike was shedding skins. And then her rag caught on something. She stopped, leaned closer, ran her fingers over the spot and felt ridges. Not damage, not corrosion, something deliberate. She wiped harder, pressing the rag into the grooves, and the shapes emerged from under the rust, like words surfacing from deep water. Two letters, engraved, not stamped, not factory, carved by hand with a tool held steady and sure, deep enough to survive decades. CM. Below the letters a date, 1978, and below that a symbol, three interlocking triangles set inside a circle. The lines precise and deliberate, each triangle overlapping the others in a pattern that felt old, ancient even. Not decoration, not a brand mark, something personal. She traced the symbol with her fingertip, felt the edges where someone had carefully removed metal, sewing it away line by line to leave this mark in the body of the machine. Whoever CM was, they had loved this bike enough to sign it, to claim it, to make it a part of themselves. And then they had let it go. She wondered who CM was, wondered if they were alive, wondered why someone would build something this personal and then abandon it in a stranger's yard to be sold for pocket change to a girl with no address and no future. That night, sitting on the concrete floor of the garage, with her back against the wall and the Harley in front of her like a puzzle she didn't have the pieces for, Breyer took a photo of the engraving and posted it on a motorcycle forum. The post was simple, 3 sentences. Found a '78 Harley Sportster. Engine seized. Anyone know where to find parts? She attached the photo and hit send and set her phone on her knee and waited. She thought she'd get advice, a link to a junkyard, maybe someone telling her to give up and part it out, maybe silence. What she got was something else entirely. The replies started within an hour, dozens of them. Most were normal, offers to sell her used parts, recommendations for mechanics in the Reno area. A few guys asking if she wanted to sell the whole bike, throwing out numbers that made her pulse quicken. 200, 350. One guy offered 500 without even seeing it in person. But mixed in with the normal replies were others. Messages that didn't read like advice. Messages that read like reconnaissance. One user asked where she'd found the bike, not casually, specifically. What state, what city, what the seller looked like. Another asked if there were any other markings on the frame, any numbers or symbols she hadn't mentioned, any compartments or modifications she could see. And then there was the last message, the one that made her stomach drop. No profile picture, no username, just a blank account created that same day minutes before the message was sent. 3 words on the screen. Where'd you get that? She stared at her phone. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Outside, a dog barked somewhere in the distance, and a car alarm went off and went quiet again. She could hear her own breathing in the metal walls of the garage. She typed a reply, kept it short. Bought it off someone in Nevada. Why? The response came in 11 seconds. She counted. 11 seconds between her question and the answer that would change the trajectory of her life. Don't sell it. Don't move it. We're coming. She read it 3 times. Each time the words felt heavier. Not a suggestion, not advice. A command, issued by someone who believed they had the authority to give one. Her first instinct was to delete the post, sell the bike, take whatever cash she could get, and disappear the way she always disappeared. Quietly, quickly, before anyone had time to notice she'd been there at all. But something stopped her. Maybe it was stubbornness. The particular kind of stubbornness that grows in people who have spent their whole lives being told what to do by strangers. Move here. Live there. Behave. Be grateful. Don't ask questions. Don't make noise. Don't exist too loudly. She was done with that. Or maybe it was the engraving, those initials, that symbol. Someone had loved this bike enough to carve their identity into its skin, and she wanted to know who. She wanted to know why a bike this loved had ended up abandoned, sold for less than a tank of gas to a girl the world had already forgotten. She didn't delete the post. She didn't sell the bike. She locked the garage door, drove to a parking lot 3 blocks away, reclined her seat, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and stared at the ceiling of the Civic until her eyes burned. She slept for 2 hours, maybe 3. In the morning, there was a new message waiting. Different sender, different tone entirely. Professional, polite. The kind of language people used when they wanted something and had learned that honey worked better than vinegar. Good morning, my name is Edward Crane. I'm a private collector of vintage Harley Davidsons, and I came across your forum post. The bike you've described is extremely rare. A '78 Sportster with hand-engraved details is a significant find. I would be willing to offer $10,000 for the motorcycle site unseen based on the photographs you've posted. I can arrange pickup within 48 hours. Please let me know if you're interested. $10,000. The number sat on her screen like a hallucination. $10,000 was more money than Breyer had seen in her entire life combined. It was a used car that actually worked. It was first and last month's rent on a real apartment. It was food for a year. It was the difference between surviving and drowning. Her thumb hovered over the reply button. She could feel the word yes forming in her mouth, could already feel the relief of it, the weight lifting, the future opening up like a door she'd never been allowed to walk through. But then she read the message again, and something snagged. He'd mentioned the engraving specifically, called them hand-engraved details. But she'd only posted one photo, a wide shot of the bike from 3 feet away. The engravings were barely visible in the image, smudged, covered in grime. You'd have to know they were there to mention them. She scrolled back to her original post, looked at the photo, zoomed in. The initials were a blur of rust and shadow. The symbol was invisible unless you already knew what you were looking for. Edward Crane knew what he was looking for. The feeling started in her gut. That low hum of wrongness she'd learned to trust in foster homes where smiles didn't match what happened after the social worker left. The instinct that said this is too easy and too easy always costs something. She didn't reply. Not yet. She put the phone down, drove to the garage, unlocked the door, and stood in front of the Harley in the gray morning light. The metal was cold under her hands. The engraving rough against her fingertips. CM 1978. 3 triangles in a circle. Who were you? What did you leave behind? And why does someone want it badly enough to offer $10,000 for a pile of rust? She started searching. Not for parts this time. For answers. Old biker forums. The kind with threads dating back to the early 2000s, archived and half forgotten, hosted on servers that looked like they hadn't been updated since dial-up. She scrolled through pages of faded text, found scanned photographs from rallies in the late 90s and early 2000s. Grainy images of men standing beside Harley's arms, crossed faces, hard-wearing patches she was beginning to recognize. She found stories, legends, the kind of oral history that lives in forum threads and bar conversations and never makes it into any official record. And she found a name, Callum Merritt, known in certain circles as Ghost, a builder, a mechanic, a man who could take a bare frame and a pile of parts and turn them into something that moved like it was alive. A Hells Angel who had been a fixture in the Nevada chapter for over a decade. A man who, according to every source she could find, every forum post, an archived article, and half-remembered story passed from one user to another, had vanished in 2007 without a word, without a body, without a goodbye. No farewell run, no funeral, no explanation, just gone. And the last bike he ever built, the bike he was seen riding days before he disappeared, was a 1978 Sportster with hand-engraved details. A bike no one had seen since the night Callum Merritt rode into the dark and didn't come back. Breyer sat on the garage floor with her phone in her hands and the Harley looming above her like a monument. The buzzing light cast shadows across the tank, and the initials seemed to shift in the uneven glow. CM Callum Merritt. She had bought a dead man's bike. Or a ghost's. She wasn't sure which was worse. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Edward Crane. Shorter this time. The politeness thinner. I'd like to finalize our arrangement. I can have a transport team at your location within 48 hours. Please confirm the address. 48 hours. The clock started ticking, and she could hear it in the silence of the garage, in the drip of water from the leaking roof, in the steady rhythm of her own pulse. She typed back 2 words. I'll think about it. His reply came fast. Too fast. Don't wait too long. Offers like this don't last. She turned her phone face down on the concrete and stared at the bike. The three triangles stared back. 36 hours later, she was under the Harley trying to free a rusted bolt with a wrench that kept slipping. Her knuckles were raw. The skin had split over her right index finger, and blood smeared across the chrome every time her hand slipped. The bolt hadn't moved in 19 years, and it wasn't planning to move now. She was so focused on the bolt that she almost didn't hear it. A sound, distant at first, low. The kind of low that you feel before you hear a vibration that starts in the floor and climbs through your knees and settles in your rib cage. She stopped, wrench frozen mid-turn. The sound grew, closer, deeper. Not one engine, not two. A convoy, full synchronized wall of thunder rolling down the street toward her garage like a wave that had been building for 19 years and had finally found its shore. And then it stopped, all at once, like someone had given a signal. Silence. The kind of silence that comes after an avalanche when the air is still full of dust, but the ground has stopped moving. Briar put down the wrench, wiped the blood on her jeans, walked to the garage door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and pushed it open. The street was full of motorcycles, Harleys mostly, lined up on both sides of the road in two perfect rows that stretched to the end of the block and around the corner. Chrome catching the late afternoon sun, paint jobs in black and deep burgundy and midnight blue colors so clean they looked wet. And standing beside them, 76 men in leather vests, arms crossed, faces unreadable, every one of them wearing the same patch on their backs, every one of them silent, every one of them watching her. She counted without meaning to. 10, 20, 30. She stopped at 50 and knew there were more. They filled the street the way water fills a canyon, completely, inevitably, as if they had always been there and the world had simply rearranged itself around them. And at the front of the line stood a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same material as the mountains behind him. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest in a way that said decades of labor, not a gym. His head was shaved on the sides, the dark gray hair on top slicked back in an undercut that showed the lines of his skull. His beard was long and full white gray falling to the middle of his chest. A small gauge piercing glinted in one ear. Both arms were bare from the shoulders down, and every inch of skin from wrist to deltoid was covered in dense dark ink. Tribal patterns interlocking with Celtic knotwork, the lines so precise and layered, they looked like they'd been burned into him rather than drawn. He wore a sleeveless black leather vest with no shirt underneath, multiple patches on the front, a red emblem badge on the chest that Briar couldn't read from this distance, dark blue jeans, boots that had walked more miles than most cars. His hands hung at his sides, and they were the largest hands she had ever seen on a human being, fingers thick as cable, knuckles scarred and smooth at the same time. But his eyes didn't match the rest of him. They were calm, patient, the kind of stillness that comes from decades of not needing to prove anything to anyone. Warm even, like a furnace banked low waiting. He studied her the way a man studies a photograph he's been carrying in his wallet for years, comparing the image to the reality, checking the details, making sure. Then he stepped forward, one step, boots crunching on gravel, and he spoke. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that had given orders to dangerous men and never needed to repeat itself. "Did he leave you anything else?" Briar stood in the doorway of her rented garage with blood on her hands and rust under her fingernails and $55 worth of dead man's motorcycle behind her. 76 men waited for her answer. The sun hung low and orange behind them, turning their silhouettes into something that looked like a painting of the end of the world. She didn't understand the question, didn't know who he was, didn't know why these men were here or what they wanted or why they looked at her rusted Harley the way people look at things that are sacred. But she understood one thing. For the first time in 18 years, someone was looking directly at her. Not through her, not past her, at her, as if she were the only thing in the frame that mattered. And that terrified her more than 76 strangers ever could. She didn't answer him. Not right away. Briar stood in the doorway of that garage with grease on her forearms and dried blood cracking on her knuckles. And she looked at Judd Harlan the way a dog looks at a hand it hasn't decided to trust yet, measuring, calculating, running the math on what it would cost her if she was wrong. She'd been wrong about adults before, every time. The gardeners with their banana bread in their yellow kitchen who replaced her with a 7-year-old boy. The Dollingers who set her bag by the door and told her to lock the screen on her way out. The social workers who stopped learning her name. Every adult she'd ever trusted had eventually revealed the same truth underneath their smiles. You are temporary. You are movable. You are not worth the effort of permanence. So she looked at this man, this mountain of leather and ink and white-gray beard, standing in the orange light of a Nevada sunset with 76 silent men behind him, and she said the only thing that made sense. I don't know what you're talking about. I bought a bike, that's all. Judd didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't shift his weight or change his expression or do any of the things people do when they're running out of patience. He just stood there, boots planted in the gravel like they'd grown roots, and he waited. The way a man waits who has been waiting for 19 years and has learned that a few more seconds won't kill him. Then he said it again, slower, not louder, as if volume had never been the point. Did he leave you anything else? Who? The man who built that bike. I don't know who built it. I bought it from some guy in Elko. $55. He didn't tell me his life story, and I didn't ask. Judd studied her face. Not the way a cop studies a suspect looking for cracks to exploit. More like the way a man reads a letter he already knows by heart, not for the words but for the handwriting. Looking for something behind the surface, something genetic. Something that reminded him of someone he'd lost. She could feel it, the weight of his attention, and it made her want to step backward into the garage and close the door and pretend none of this was happening. But she didn't step back. She'd spent 18 years stepping back. She was done retreating. That bike, Judd said, belonged to a brother, a man named Callum Merritt. People called him Ghost. He built it with his own hands from the frame up, engraved it himself, rode it every day for years. And then in 2007, he disappeared, rode into the dark and didn't come home. No goodbye, no body, nothing. He paused, let the words settle. We've been looking for that bike ever since. Tracked it through 3 states, 6 owners, a dozen dead ends, and now you have it. Briar felt the air in her lungs turn solid. She thought of the forum post, the messages, the blank account that said, "We're coming." She thought of Edward Crane and his $10,000 offer and his knowledge of engravings he shouldn't have been able to see. So what, she said, you want it back? Something moved behind Judd's eyes, something that looked just for a second like pain, like she'd said the one thing he'd been afraid she would say. No, he said, I want to show you something. Then you decide. Decide what? Whether you want to know who you are. The sentence landed on her like a hand on the back of the neck. She felt it in her spine, in the base of her skull, in the place where the body stores things the mind hasn't processed yet. You've got 36 hours, Judd continued. His voice was level, but there was urgency beneath it. Controlled urgency, the kind that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't. Before someone else gets to that bike, someone who doesn't want to show you anything, someone who wants what he thinks is hidden inside it. And I'm telling you right now, you don't want to meet him unprepared. 36 hours, the same window Edward Crane had given her, the clock that had been ticking since his last message. She could hear it now louder than before, synchronized with the thud of her pulse. She should have said no, should have told them to leave, should have gone back inside and locked the door and called the first buyer who'd offered $200 and sold the Harley and driven east until Nevada was a memory. But Briar didn't say no, because underneath the fear, underneath the suspicion, underneath 18 years of scar tissue built up over every place a person could be hurt, there was something else. A sound, faint, persistent, the sound of a question she'd been carrying her entire life without knowing how to ask it. Why did no one want me? And this man with the white beard and the warm eyes and the tattoos like armor was standing in front of her, saying there might be an answer. She followed. They drove 30 miles outside the city, past strip malls and fast food chains, and then past farmland, and then past nothing. The kind of emptiness that only exists in the spaces between Nevada towns where the road is straight enough to see the curvature of the earth and the sky is so wide it feels like a weight pressing down. Briar drove the Civic. Judd rode beside her on a black Road King with ape hangers and forward controls, his beard streaming over his shoulder in the wind. The rest of the convoy followed in a formation so precise it looked choreographed. 76 engines in synchronization to sound like a river made of iron. The storage facility sat at the end of a dirt road behind a rusted gate that hadn't been painted in decades. A cluster of corrugated metal units arranged in rows, the kind of place where people stored boats they'd never use again, and furniture from marriages that didn't survive. The owner operated out of a single wide trailer near the entrance and didn't come out when 76 motorcycles rolled past his window. In a place like this, you learn not to ask questions as long as the rent got paid. Judd walked her to Unit 47. The number was stenciled on the door in faded white paint, the 7 slightly crooked. He pulled a key from his vest pocket, the metal worn smooth and bright from handling. From years of being held and turned over and held again by hands that were keeping a promise. The padlock clicked. The door rolled up with a metallic groan that echoed off the empty units around them, and the late afternoon light cut into the darkness inside like a blade. Breyer stepped forward and stopped. The unit was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, but it had been arranged with a care that made the space feel like something else entirely. Not a storage locker, a shrine, not to religion, to memory. Boxes stacked neatly against the back wall, labeled in handwriting that was precise and slanted. Baby clothes, medical records, birth certificate. The ink on the labels had faded from black to gray, but the letters were still legible, still sharp, written by a hand that wanted them to last. Against the left wall, a crib, disassembled but preserved. The wood cleaned the screws in a labeled bag taped to the headboard. Beside it, a plastic bin filled with tiny onesies and blankets still in their packaging. Tags still attached. Prices from 2007 still visible. Never opened, never used. Bought for a child who never slept in them. On the right wall, photographs. Framed and mounted at eye level, protected from dust by sheets of clear plastic. A man holding a newborn in a hospital room, the man's face half hidden by shadow, but his hands visible. Large hands, scarred and calloused, and impossibly gentle around the bundle of white cloth in his arms. Another photo, the same man standing beside a motorcycle. The motorcycle, the 1978 Sportster, its chrome gleaming in sunlight. He was smiling. The only photo where he was smiling. And in the center of the unit, on a small metal table under a single bare bulb that Judd reached up and turned on with a pull chain, sat a lockbox. Steel. Heavy. The kind with a combination dial and reinforced corners. The kind you buy when you need something to survive longer than you will. Judd knelt beside it, his knees cracked on the concrete. He turned the dial. Left, right, left again. 3 numbers he'd memorized 19 years ago and never written down because some things are safer in the body than on paper. The lock opened. Inside were letters, dozens of them. White envelopes, each one addressed in the same slanted handwriting to a single name, Emma. No last name, no return address, no stamps. These letters were never meant for the postal service. They were meant for a person who might never exist, written on the chance that someday, somehow, they would find their way home. Beneath the letters, a cassette tape. The label faded but legible. 5 words in handwriting that matched the envelopes for when she's old enough. And beneath the tape, pressed flat against the bottom of the box, a single sheet of paper. A birth certificate. State of Nevada. Female child. Born March 15th, 2007. Mother Sarah Colvin. Deceased. Father listed as unknown. But the paper wasn't what made Breyer's hands begin to shake. What made her hands shake was the inside of the lockbox lid. The underside, where someone had taken a tool, the same tool that had engraved the Harley's tank and carved 2 letters into the steel. B.C. Breyer Colvin. The air left the room. Or maybe it left her body. She couldn't tell. She was aware of her hands trembling, aware of Judd watching her, aware of the bulb swinging slightly on its chain and casting shadows that moved across the walls like living things. But she couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at her own initials carved into a box that had been waiting for her in the dark for 19 years. Callum didn't give her up because he didn't want her. The voice came from behind her. Not Judd, someone else. A woman. Breyer turned. Standing just inside the doorway was a woman in her mid-50s with short silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved by grief and then polished by time into something that was not beautiful, but was honest, completely painfully honest. She wore a flannel shirt and jeans and boots that had seen more dirt roads than pavement. Her name was Nola Vickers, and she had been waiting to say these words for 19 years. His name was Callum, Nola said. Everyone called him Ghost, but his real name was Callum Merritt. Your mother was Sarah Colvin. They met in Sparks, Nevada in 2005. She was a waitress. He was trouble. The kind of trouble that parks a Harley outside your diner every morning and orders the same coffee and leaves the same tip and never asks for your number because he knows he doesn't deserve it. Nola stepped closer. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She gave him her number anyway. They were together for 2 years. When she got pregnant, Callum tried to change, tried to pull away from the life. But the life doesn't let go that easy. And there were people, dangerous people, who didn't want him to leave. What people? Breyer's voice came out as a rasp, barely audible. Judd answered. He was still kneeling beside the lockbox, and he looked up at her with those warm, impossible eyes set in that hard, impossible face. A man named Lyle Crandall. He was one of us. A brother, or we thought he was. In 2005, we found out Lyle had been feeding information to a rival club, the Vagos, giving them our roots, our contacts, our business. Callum was the one who found the proof, and Callum was the one who brought it to the table. Lyle was out, Nola continued, stripped of his patch, expelled. But men like Lyle don't disappear. They hold grudges, and Lyle's grudge had a target, your father. The pieces were assembling in Breyer's mind like wreckage surfacing after a shipwreck. Slow, ugly, inevitable. Your mother died the night you were born, Nola said. Her voice cracked for the first time. She steadied it, kept going. Complications. Callum was in the waiting room when they told him. I was with him. He didn't make a sound, just sat there with his hands on his knees, staring at the floor. And then the nurse brought you out, this tiny thing wrapped in a white blanket, and he held you like you were made of glass. She stopped, swallowed. Breyer could see the muscles in her throat working. He tried to raise you himself for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of formula and diapers and no sleep, and a man who could rebuild a transmission in the dark trying to figure out how to hold a bottle at the right angle. And he was good at it, better than anyone expected. But Lyle was still out there, and Lyle had started making threats, not against Callum, against you. Breyer felt the floor shift beneath her, not physically, somewhere deeper. Before your father went to the club, Nola said he came to me. Middle of the night, he had you in a car seat and a bag packed, and this look in his eyes like a man who had already decided something terrible and was just waiting for his body to catch up. He asked me to drive you to the hospital, to tell them you were found at the entrance. No note, no name, just a baby. Nola's voice dropped to almost nothing. He kissed your forehead, stood in the driveway, and then he walked into the dark and didn't look back. The silence that followed was absolute. No engines, no wind, just the hum of the bare bulb and the sound of Breyer's breathing, which had become something she had to think about. In, out. Like her body had forgotten the rhythm and needed to be reminded. She looked at the crib, at the clothes with their tags still attached, at the letters addressed to Emma, the name he'd chosen for her before the world took that choice away. At the photographs of a man she had never met holding a baby she didn't remember being. He didn't abandon you. Judd's voice, low, certain. He hid you because staying would have gotten you killed. Judd stood slowly, his knees cracked again. He crossed his arms over that massive chest and leaned against the wall of the unit, and for the first time he told her his own story. Not because it was about him, because it was about the man who connected them both. I was 15 when I met Callum, he said, sleeping behind a Denny's in Carson City. Hadn't eaten in 2 days, hadn't been inside a building in a week. My old man was a drunk who used his fists the way most men use words, and my mother left when I was 9, so I ran. Same as you, different roads, same direction. Away. He paused. His thumb rubbed the scar on his right knuckle. Once, twice, then stopped. Callum found me behind that Denny's. Didn't call the cops. Didn't call social services. He bought me a plate of eggs, and he sat across from me, and he didn't say a word until I was done eating. Then he said one thing. He said, "You want to learn how to build something?" And I said, "Yeah," because nobody had ever asked me if I wanted anything before. He looked at Briar directly, without flinching. He taught me how to build engines, how to read a schematic, how to use my hands for something other than protecting my face. He gave me a purpose when the world had decided I didn't need one. And when he disappeared, when he walked into the dark and left everything behind, he left me one instruction: find the bike. When you find the bike, you'll find her. And make sure she knows. His voice didn't crack, but something behind it did. He saved me first. Finding you is paying that back. Briar looked at Judd Harlan, this enormous man with armor tattooed into his skin and a beard like a war banner, and eyes that held a 15-year-old boy's gratitude beneath 40 years of hard living. And she saw it, the mirror, the reflection. Two people standing on opposite sides of the same story, both of them saved by a man who had loved others more than he loved his own survival. A man stepped forward from the group gathered outside the unit, shorter than Judd, leaner, built like a cable under tension, late 40s with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. Crooked nose, deep-set eyes, a jaw that hadn't relaxed in maybe a decade. His name was Colt Jessup, and he was holding a notebook. Not a regular notebook, a mechanic's journal. Leather cover oil-stained and soft from years of handling. Pages thick with drawings and measurements, and notes written in a hand that was part engineer, part artist. He held it out to Briar without ceremony. Without explanation, just extended his arm and waited. She took it, opened it, and on the first page in the same handwriting that labeled the boxes and addressed the letters were two words: for her. She turned the pages. Drawings of the Sportster, every bolt, every angle, every weld point mapped with the precision of someone who understood that a motorcycle isn't just a machine. It's a statement, a philosophy, a living thing that carries the weight of whoever built it. And in the margins between the technical notes and the torque specifications and the parts lists were other notes, smaller, more personal. She'll need to know how the timing works. Show her how to listen to the engine. It tells you everything. Make sure she knows the front brake is her friend. Ghost used to say the rear brake is for parking lots. He had built the bike thinking about a daughter he might never meet. Had written instructions for a girl he was gambling would someday exist in his world again. Had poured every ounce of love he couldn't deliver in person into the metal and the ink and the hope that the brothers would keep their word. Briar closed the notebook, held it against her chest, and felt something crack behind her sternum that she hadn't known was solid. "The collector," she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, the kind of control that costs everything to maintain. "The one who offered me $10,000, Edward Crane. That's not his real name, is it?" Judd shook his head slowly. "His name is Lyle Crandall." The name dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. She could feel the ripples spreading, could feel the shape of the story changing around her, rearranging itself into something darker and more dangerous than a girl finding her father's motorcycle. "He's been monitoring every bike forum, every auction site, every junkyard listing in 3 states for 19 years, Judd said, waiting for that bike to surface. He believes your father hid something before he disappeared. Club records, financial documents, evidence that Lyle thinks is worth killing for. He doesn't care about the bike. He cares about what he believes is inside it." "Is there something inside it?" "Your father took the club's financial ledgers when he left, to keep Lyle from using them as leverage with the Vagos. But there's no money hidden in that frame. No treasure. Just a motorcycle a man built for his daughter. Lyle spent 19 years chasing a ghost, and now he's found you instead." Nola stepped forward. Her eyes were dry now, but her voice still carried the weight of what she'd told. Before Callum disappeared, he brought the ledgers to the club, handed them to the president himself. Every page accounted for. Every dollar. Lyle was already gone by then, expelled, cut off. But he never believed the money was returned. He built a story in his head that Callum skimmed the accounts, hid a fortune somewhere in the bike, or with the bike, and then ran. 19 years he's been feeding that story. It's the only thing keeping him alive. The only thing that makes his betrayal feel like it was worth something. Briar looked at the lockbox, at the tape, at the notebook pressed against her ribs. She thought about Edward Crane's messages, the politeness that thinned with every exchange, the knowledge of engravings he shouldn't have known about, the 48-hour window that was now a 30-hour window and shrinking. She thought about running, the old reflex, the familiar mathematics of survival. Leave the bike, leave the letters, leave the crib and the clothes and the photographs and the notebook and the tape and everything this man left behind for a daughter he loved too much to keep. Leave it all and drive east and become invisible again. Because invisible was safe. Invisible was what she knew. But for the first time in her life, invisible felt like a betrayal. They moved the Harley that night. 3 of Judd's men loaded it onto a flatbed and drove it to a garage behind Colt's house in Washoe Valley, a cinder block building with a steel door and a lock that weighed more than Breyer's duffel bag. Judd posted 2 men outside, rotating shifts. He didn't ask Breyer if she wanted protection. He just arranged it. The way you arrange sandbags before a flood. Not because you're sure it's coming, because you know what it costs if you're wrong. Breyer slept in the garage that night, not in the Civic. In the garage on a cot Colt set up in the corner without being asked. She lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the desert through the walls. Coyotes, wind, the occasional rumble of a truck on the distant highway, and the smaller sounds. The tick of cooling metal from the Harley, the creak of the cot springs, her own breathing which still required conscious effort as if the mechanism had been disrupted by what she'd learned and hadn't fully reset. She was still awake when the sound came. The particular sound of a boot on gravel that doesn't belong to anyone who's supposed to be there. She sat up. The garage was dark. Moonlight through the high window laid a stripe of silver across the floor. The Harley sat where they'd left it, tank dull and frame bent, looking nothing like something worth $10,000 or 19 years of searching. Outside voices, low, tense. Then a sound she recognized from 100 different foster homes in 100 different towns. The sound of a man trying to be quiet and failing. She moved to the window, pressed her face against the glass, and saw him. Not Lyle Crandall, not yet. Someone younger, mid-20s. Wearing a vest, she recognized the same patches, the same configuration. One of Judd's men, one of the brothers, and he was standing at the gate talking to someone on his phone, his back turned to the garage, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying in the desert silence like a confession. She's here. The bike's here. Colt's place, Washoe Valley. The cinder block garage behind the house. Yeah, I know. How much? Breyer's stomach dropped. The floor fell away and she was standing on nothing, suspended over the familiar void of betrayal, the void she knew better than any address she'd ever lived at. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Watched the man finish his call and slip his phone into his pocket and resume his position by the gate as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just sold her location to the man who wanted to take apart her father's last gift bolt by bolt. 20 minutes later, an engine, not a motorcycle, a truck. Black, no headlights, rolling up the dirt road with the slow deliberation of someone who knows exactly where they're going. It stopped 50 yards from the gate. The engine cut, a door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, thin in a way that suggested not hunger but efficiency. Everything stripped down to the essential. Mid-60s with a face like a hatchet, narrow and angular, and eyes that reflected the moonlight like coins at the bottom of a well. He wore a leather jacket, not a vest, and he moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned a long time ago that wasted motion was wasted opportunity. Lyle Crandall crossed the distance to the gate in 12 strides. The young brother opened it for him without a word. Lyle didn't thank him, didn't acknowledge him, just walked through like the gate had opened on its own. He was halfway to the garage door when Breyer stepped outside. She didn't plan it, didn't think about it. Her body made the decision the way her body had made every survival decision for 18 years, faster than thought, more honest than reason. She stepped through the side door and into the moonlight and stood between Lyle Crandall and the garage with nothing in her hands and nothing in her pockets in 19 years of being invisible as her only weapon. He stopped, looked at her, and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has just realized that the only thing standing between him and what he wants is a girl who weighs less than his jacket. "You must be the buyer," he said, His voice was soft, almost pleasant. The one who paid $55 for something she doesn't understand. I understand enough. You understand nothing. That bike doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to some orphan girl playing mechanic in a rented garage. It belongs to men who earned it, men who bled for it, and a dead man who stole from his own brothers before he ran. He didn't steal from anyone, and he wasn't running from the club. He was running from you. Lyle's smile thinned. Who told you that Judd is a sentimental old man guarding a dead man's fairy tale? Callum Merritt was a thief. He took what didn't belong to him, and he hid it in that machine, and he disappeared. I've been patient, 19 years patient, and now a teenager with a grease on her face is going to tell me I'm wrong. He stepped forward. One step. Calculated. Briar didn't move. She could feel her heartbeat in her temples, in her wrists, in the soles of her feet against the cold ground. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run, to fold, to become small and invisible and let the adults handle whatever this was because that's what she'd always done. But something had changed. In that storage unit, standing in front of a crib that had never been slept in, and letters that had never been opened, and a lockbox that carried her name like a prayer, something had shifted in the architecture of who she was. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had been hidden, deliberately, carefully, by a man who loved her enough to disappear so she could survive. And she was done being hidden. Invisible doesn't mean gone, she said. Lyle tilted his head, the way a predator tilts its head when prey does something unexpected. Behind her, the sound of boots on gravel, multiple, moving fast, and then Judd's voice cutting through the dark like a blade through rope. That's far enough, Lyle. Judd emerged from the shadows on the east side of the building. Colt came from the west. Behind them, 8 more men materialized from the darkness like they'd been part of it all along. They formed a line behind Briar, not in front of her, behind her, as if she were the one leading and they were the ones following. Lyle looked at the line of men, counted, did the math. His smile didn't change, but his eyes did. Something in them recalculated. This isn't over, Lyle said. It was over 19 years ago, Judd replied. You just didn't know it. Lyle looked at Briar one more time, held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked back to his truck with the same measured stride, the same economy of motion. The engine started. The headlights stayed off. He backed down the dirt road and disappeared into the dark as if the night had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. Judd turned to the young brother who had opened the gate. The kid was standing by the fence, face pale in the moonlight, hands shaking. He knew, they all knew. Judd walked to him, stopped close enough that the kid had to look up to meet his eyes. The kid opened his mouth, started to say something, an excuse maybe, a justification, a reason that would make sense if you squinted hard enough. Judd shook his head. Once, slowly. The kid reached up with trembling hands and unzipped his vest, pulled it off, held it out. Judd took it without looking at it, folded it once, tucked it under his arm, and walked away. No words, no shouting, no threats, just the removal of something that had been given in trust and had been betrayed. The silence was heavier than any punishment could have been. The kid stood by the fence in his t-shirt arms, wrapped around himself, and watched the men walk away from him. And in that silence, everyone understood what loyalty cost and what betrayal earned. Briar watched from the garage doorway. She watched the kid's face. She watched Judd's back. She watched the vest disappear under his arm like a flag being retired. And she felt the old machinery engage. The familiar gears of distrust grinding into position, the ones that had protected her in 7 homes in a dozen towns in a lifetime of temporary people. If one of them could betray the others, any of them could. If a brother could sell her location for money, then brotherhood was just another word for convenience. Just another system that pretended to care until the price was right. She went inside the garage, closed the door, locked it. Colt knocked 20 minutes later. She didn't answer. Nola came an hour after that, stood outside and said her name once, softly, like a question. Briar didn't respond. And then at 2 in the morning it started to rain. Not a desert drizzle, a proper downpour. The kind that turns dirt roads to rivers and hammers on metal roofs like fists. The kind of rain that says the sky is angry about something and doesn't care who gets wet. Briar lay on the cot in the dark, listening to the rain pound the walls, and she heard something underneath it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. Breathing, steady, patient, just outside the door. She got up, walked to the door, pressed her ear against the cold steel. Judd Harlan was standing outside in the rain. She could hear him, could hear the water hitting his leather vest, could hear his boots shifting in the mud, could hear the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had decided to stand in one place and not move until something changed or the world ended, whichever came first. He didn't knock, didn't call her name, didn't ask to be let in. He just stood there, in the dark, in the rain. The way he'd stood outside 100 doors in 100 different situations across a lifetime, built on the principle that showing up is the only thing that can't be faked. Briar pressed her forehead against the door, felt the cold metal against her skin, felt the vibration of the rain through the steel. And on the other side, close enough that only the thickness of a door separated them, Judd pressed his palm flat against the same panel. He didn't know she was there. Or maybe he did. It didn't matter. He wasn't standing in the rain to be seen. He was standing in the rain because a man he loved like a father had asked him to protect something, and he would stand in every rainstorm left in the world before he broke that promise. The rain fell harder. The night got colder. Neither of them moved. She opened the door at dawn, not because she'd decided to trust them, not because the night had delivered some revelation that dissolved 19 years of scar tissue and made everything make sense. She opened the door because the rain had stopped and the silence that replaced it was worse. The silence sounded like every empty room she'd ever stood in, every house she'd been removed from, every car she'd slept in while the world kept turning without bothering to check if she was still in it. And because she could still hear him breathing, the hinges groaned. Gray light spilled across the concrete floor and reached the Harley's front tire like a hand. And there was Judd Harlan, standing exactly where he'd been 7 hours ago. Boots sunk 2 inches into the mud, vest dark and heavy with water. That white-gray beard plastered to his chest like wet rope, his arms at his sides, his hands open. Not clenched, not ready for anything except waiting. He looked at her. Water ran from his hair down the ridge of his brow and dripped off his jaw. His eyes were red from the cold. His lips were pale. He looked like a man who had been standing in a river all night and had refused to drown on principle. He didn't say good morning, didn't say I told you so, didn't say anything about the locked door or the silence or the hours he'd spent getting hammered by a Nevada rainstorm while she lay on a cot 8 feet away and pretended he wasn't there. He just looked at her, patient, present. The way a lighthouse looks at the sea, not because it expects the sea to change, because standing there is what it was built to do. Briar stepped aside, left the doorway open, walked back to the cot and sat down with her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around them. The universal posture of a person who isn't ready to speak but isn't willing to be alone anymore. Judd stepped inside. Water ran off him and pooled on the concrete. He didn't sit, didn't approach the bike, didn't do anything except stand near the door and give her the only thing she'd never been given by an adult in her life. Space. Space without abandonment. Presence without pressure. The radical act of being in the same room as someone and asking for nothing. They stayed like that for 11 minutes, she counted. Then she spoke. The tape, she said. The cassette from the lockbox. Judd reached into his vest, the inside pocket, waterproof lined with something that had kept the contents dry despite 7 hours of rain. He pulled out the cassette, held it the way you hold something that might break if your fingers tighten even slightly, and he crossed the room and set it on the edge of the cot beside her. There's a player in the corner, he said. Colt brought it over last night, before the rain. She turned her head. In the corner on a wooden crate that hadn't been there when she'd locked the door sat a cassette player. Old, silver and black, the kind with a speaker built into the lid and a handle on top for carrying. Someone had cleaned it recently. The buttons gleamed under the fluorescent light. Colt had set it up. Before the rain, before the betrayal, before she'd locked the door and shut everyone out. He'd anticipated this moment the way a mechanic anticipates a part wearing down. Not with worry, with preparation. I'll be outside, Judd said. He turned toward the door. Stay. The word came out before she could stop it. Small, barely a sound, more like a leak in something that had been sealed too tight for too long. Judd stopped, turned back, looked at her, and nodded once. He moved to the far wall and leaned against it with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor, giving her the privacy of not being watched, while giving her the presence of not being alone. Breyer picked up the cassette. It weighed almost nothing, a rectangle of plastic and magnetic tape that had been sitting in a steel box in a dark room for 19 years, waiting for a pair of hands that hadn't existed when it was recorded. She turned it over, read the label again. 5 words in faded ink. For when she's old enough. She walked to the corner, inserted the tape. Her fingers were shaking so badly she had to use both hands to guide it into the slot. The mechanism caught. She pressed play. Static, a hiss of white noise that sounded like distance. Like years being compressed into a frequency the human ear could almost but not quite understand. And then a voice. Rough, tired. The kind of tired that lives in the bones, not the muscles, but steady, deliberate. A voice that had rehearsed what it was about to say 100 times and had decided that rehearsal didn't matter because the truth doesn't need practice. My name is Callum Merritt. Some people call me Ghost. If you're hearing this, it means you found what I left behind. It means the brothers kept their word. It means you're old enough now to hear the truth. Breyer's chest tightened. She could feel her ribs pressing inward like the walls of a room getting smaller. I don't know your name. I wanted to name you Emma, but I don't know what they called you. I don't know where you grew up or who raised you or whether they were kind to you. I hope they were. God, I hope they were kind. His voice cracked on the word kind, just barely. A fracture in the steadiness that lasted half a second and revealed everything underneath. I need you to know something. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I didn't give you up because you weren't enough. You were everything. You were the only thing I ever built that mattered more than metal. Breyer pressed her hand against her mouth, not to stifle a sound, to hold herself together, to keep whatever was breaking inside her from spilling out onto the concrete floor of a garage in Washoe Valley, Nevada, in front of a man she'd known for less than 2 days. Your mother's name was Sarah. She was the bravest person I ever met, braver than me, braver than any man I ever rode with. She loved you before you had a heartbeat. She talked to you when you were still inside her, told you stories, made plans. She wanted to teach you how to swim. She said every girl should know how to swim because water doesn't care how strong you are, it only cares whether you know how to move through it. The tape hissed, a pause, the sound of a man collecting what was left of himself. She died bringing you into the world, and I tried to hold both of those things at the same time. The grief of losing her and the miracle of finding you. For 6 weeks I held them both. I fed you at 3 in the morning and I cried at 4. And by 5, I was watching you sleep and thinking that maybe I could do this. Maybe I could be what you needed. Another pause. Longer this time. But there were men looking for me. A man I'd exposed. A man who'd sell his own blood for leverage. And he made it clear that you were the leverage he'd use, not me. You, a 6-week-old baby sleeping in a crib I built from pine boards and hope. Judd shifted against the wall. The leather of his vest creaked. His jaw was tight and his eyes were still on the floor, but his hands, those enormous scarred hands, were gripping his own forearms hard enough to leave marks. So I made a choice. The hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than any fight. Harder than losing your mother. I gave you to someone I trusted, and I asked her to take you somewhere safe. Somewhere my name couldn't follow you. Somewhere you could grow up without my enemies knowing you existed. I left you the bike because it's the only thing I ever built that comes close to what I feel for Yanu. Every bolt I turned, I was thinking about you. Every weld I laid, I was imagining the day you'd sit on that seat and feel what I felt. Freedom. Real freedom. Not running from something, moving towards something, the feeling of the road opening up and the engine answering, and nothing behind you that matters more than what's ahead. And I left you the brothers, because they'll do what I can't. They'll stand in the rain when you lock the door. They'll be there when you're ready, and they'll make sure you know that you came from something, that you mattered, that you were never not for 1 single second forgotten. I love you, I'm sorry, and I hope someday you ride that Harley and understand. The tape ran out, the player clicked, The reels stopped turning, and the static faded to nothing, and the garage was silent except for the drip of water from the leaking roof hitting the concrete in a rhythm that sounded like a clock that had finally stopped counting. Briar stood in front of the cassette player with her hand still over her mouth and tears running down her face in two straight lines. She didn't wipe them, didn't acknowledge them. They fell from her jaw under her shirt and darkened the fabric in small circles that spread and merged and disappeared. She had spent 18 years believing she was a mistake. 18 years absorbing the quiet, constant message that seeped through every foster home and every social worker's office and every school she attended for 6 months before being transferred to another. You are unwanted. You are a problem to be processed. You are a file number in a system that runs on paperwork and indifference. And now a dead man's voice was telling her the opposite, telling her she was so wanted that a father had destroyed his own life to keep her safe, so loved that 76 men had spent 19 years keeping a promise to a ghost. She cried, not quietly, not politely, the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it doesn't have a name, the kind that sounds like something being torn open, like a wound that was never treated finally being cleaned. It hurt. It was supposed to hurt. 19 years of scar tissue don't dissolve without pain. Judd didn't move, didn't speak, didn't cross the room to comfort her. He understood something that most people don't, that some grief is private even when it happens in front of witnesses, that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for a person who is breaking open is to stand still and let them break. When it passed, when the shaking stopped and her breathing found its rhythm again, and the tears dried to salt on her cheeks, Briar turned to Judd and said 5 words. He said he left something. Judd straightened. In the tape? He said the bike. He said every bolt. But he also said something at the end. Something about leaving me the only thing he built that comes close. He repeated it like it was important. Judd looked at the Harley, the rusted, bent, broken machine, sitting in the middle of the garage like a patient on an operating table. He walked to it, ran his hand along the frame, down the top tube, along the backbone, to the handlebars. He stopped, gripped the left handlebar, twisted it. Nothing. Gripped the right, twisted. The rubber grip shifted, rotated a quarter turn farther than it should have. Something inside the handlebar tube clicked. Judd looked at Briar. She crossed the room. Together they pulled the grip free. Inside the hollow steel tube of the handlebar, wrapped in a plastic bag sealed with electrical tape, was a USB drive. Small, black. The kind that holds maybe 8 gigabytes. The kind that didn't exist in 1978 when the bike was built, but existed in 2007 when a man was preparing to disappear. Colt appeared in the doorway. He'd been outside keeping watch, but the sound of the grip being removed had drawn him in. He reached into his back pocket and produced a laptop so old it looked like it might have been manufactured in the same decade as the Harley. But it powered on, and it had a USB port. Briar plugged in the drive. 1 folder, 1 file, a video, 37 seconds long. She clicked play. The image was grainy, low resolution, shot on a camera that was cheap even by 2007 standards. A kitchen, small, cluttered with motorcycle parts and baby bottles, the collision of 2 lives that didn't belong in the same room but were trying anyway. And in the center of the frame, a man. She couldn't see his face clearly. The camera was positioned too low and the lighting was bad, and he was looking down at something in his arms. But she could see his hands, large, scarred, calloused, the same hands from the photographs in the storage unit. And in those hands, wrapped in a white blanket, a baby. Tiny, eyes closed, fingers curled into fists the size of walnuts. The man was singing, quietly, under his breath. A song she didn't recognize. Not a lullaby, something rougher. Something that sounded like a road song, the kind of thing you'd hum on a highway with the wind in your face and no destination. He was adapting it, slowing it down, turning it into something soft enough for a 6-week-old baby to sleep through. And then he looked up, directly at the camera. And for 3 seconds, Briar Colvin saw her father's face. Not a photograph, not a name on a document. His face. Tired and young and terrified and full of a love so concentrated it looked like pain. He smiled. A small smile, the kind that exists only when no one is supposed to be watching. The kind that says I am holding the entire meaning of my life in my arms and I know I'm about to lose it. The video ended. The screen went black. The cursor blinked. Briar closed the laptop, placed her palms flat on the surface, and sat very still for a long time. She had been held. She had been sung to. She had been loved by a man whose hands could build an engine from nothing and whose voice could turn a road song into a lullaby. And she had proof. Not a story, not a letter, not secondhand testimony from people who were there. Proof. 37 seconds of unedited, irreversible proof that she had not entered this world unwanted. She looked up at Colt, the lean, quiet man who had kept a mechanic's notebook for 19 years and had set up a cassette player before being asked. His face hadn't changed, still assembled from spare parts, still wound tight, but his eyes were wet, and he was pretending they weren't. "Show me how to fix his bike," Briar said. They started that afternoon, and for 3 weeks they didn't stop. The 76 men returned the next morning. Not in formation this time, not in a show of force. They came in groups of 8 and 10, pulling into Colt's driveway in trucks loaded with toolboxes and parts, and the accumulated expertise of men who had been building motorcycles since before Briar was born. They wore their vests and their boots, and they got on their knees on the concrete floor of the garage, and they worked beside a girl who didn't know a spark plug from a piston. And they taught her. Colt taught her the engine, how to pull the cylinders and inspect the bore, how to check the piston rings for wear, how to clean the carburetor with a toothbrush and solvent every jet, every passage, every needle valve, until the fuel would flow through it like blood through a vein. He didn't explain things twice, didn't simplify. He taught her the way Ghost had taught him, by doing it, by putting the tools in her hands and letting her make mistakes and correcting the mistakes with a gesture or a single word, never a speech. Judd taught her the frame, how to measure the rake and trail, how to check the neck bearings, how to straighten a bend using a hydraulic press and a patience she didn't know she had. He worked beside her for hours without speaking, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full. The way a room is full when two people are building something together and the building is the conversation. Nola came every day with food, sandwiches and coffee, and on the third day, a peach cobbler that she set on the workbench without comment. Briar ate standing up, one hand on a wrench grease on her chin. Nola watched her and saw something in the way the girl held the tools, something familiar, a steadiness, a focus. The genetic echo of the man who had stood in this same posture in this same state 2 decades ago, building a machine out of love and metal. On the 9th day, Briar installed the spark plugs. She threaded the first one in perfectly, gapped it, torqued it, connected the wire. Then she reached for the second cylinder and threaded the plug in backward, cross-threaded it into aluminum heads that had survived 47 years without a scratch and would now need to be retapped. The garage went quiet. 15 men stopped what they were doing and looked at the cylinder head, at the cross-threaded plug. It had Briar, who was staring at what she'd done with the expression of a person who has just accidentally insulted someone's mother in a language they don't speak. Colt leaned over, looked at the plug, looked at Briar, and said the longest sentence anyone in the club had heard him say in 10 years. "Your daddy would have welded your wrench to the floor for that." The garage erupted. Not laughter exactly, something deeper. The kind of sound men make when the tension breaks and the moment is human, and the girl they've been treating like porcelain proves she's as capable of screwing up as the rest of them. Briar felt her face go red, and then she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. She was laughing with her hands covered in grease and a ruined spark plug in her palm, and 15 men in leather vests grinning at her like she was one of them. Not because she'd earned it through perfection, because she'd earned it through imperfection, through showing up and trying and failing in front of people and not running away from the failure. Colt retapped the head himself, showed her how, made her do the next one. She got it right. On the 14th day, a boy showed up at the gate, 16 years old, maybe 17, thin, nervous, wearing a t-shirt 2 sizes too big and shoes that were falling apart. He asked for Judd, said he'd heard the club was looking for help, said he could sweep floors, fetch parts, carry things. Anything. He just needed something to do, somewhere to be. Judd looked at him for a long time. The same way Callum Merritt had once looked at a 15-year-old boy sleeping behind a Denny's in Carson City, calculating not what the kid could do, but what the kid needed. "You eat today," Judd asked. The kid shook his head. Judd looked at Nola. Nola was already unwrapping a sandwich. She handed it to the boy without a word, the way she did everything with the economy of a woman who had learned that action speaks in a register that words can't reach. The kid ate. Judd put a broom in his hands. And by the end of the day, the boy was handing Briar tools when she called for them, learning the names of wrenches and sockets, the way she had learned them 2 weeks before, by touching them, by using them, by getting it wrong and trying again. Briar watched the kid and saw herself. Saw the duffel bag, saw the empty pockets, saw the particular hunger that has nothing to do with food and everything to do with being needed, and she understood something she hadn't understood before. The chain didn't start with her. It started with Callum saving Judd, and it didn't end with her either. It moved forward, link by link, each person who had been found reaching back for the next person, still lost. By the end of the third week, the Harley was complete. New gaskets, new cables, new tires. The chrome cleaned and polished until it caught the light like mirrors. The tank repainted in flat black with the engravings preserved, the initials and the date, and the 3 triangles visible through the paint like bones beneath skin. The engine rebuilt from the inside out, every bearing and bushing and seal replaced with the precision of men who understood that this machine was not just transportation. It was a message. From a father to a daughter across 19 years of darkness. They pushed the bike outside for the first start. 76 men in a circle, Briar in the center. The Nevada sun high and hot, and the sky so blue it looked fake. Colt handed her the key. She inserted it, turned it. The dash lights flickered. The fuel pump hummed. She pulled the choke, set her foot on the kickstarter, and brought her weight down. Nothing. The engine turned over but didn't catch. She kicked again. Again. On the fourth kick, something deep in the machine shifted. The cylinders fired, one then the other. The exhaust cracked like a gunshot and then settled into a rhythm. That rhythm, the potato-potato idol of a Harley V-twin, uneven and alive, and breathing the sound she had stood on the side of the highways to feel in her chest. The engine of her father's motorcycle ran for the first time in 19 years, and 76 men stood in silence and listened to it breathe. Judd waited until the engine was warm, until the idle smoothed out and the oil pressure stabilized and the machine stopped shaking off 19 years of sleep. Then he reached behind his back and produced a vest. Not new, not clean. Leather worn soft by years of handling, no patches, no rank, just 2 details. On the front, stitched in white thread against the black leather, her name Briar. And on the back, in larger letters, 2 words that carried the weight of a promise kept across 2 decades. Ghost's daughter. He held it out to her. She took it. The leather was warm from being pressed against his back. She put it on over her t-shirt and felt the weight settle on her shoulders. Not heavy, grounding, like being tethered to the earth for the first time, like standing on solid ground after 18 years of floating. She looked at Judd, at Colt, at Nola, at the men standing in a circle around her, these strangers who had spent 3 weeks on their knees teaching her to build something her father had designed for her before she could hold her own head up. These men who had stood in rain and confronted betrayal and kept a promise to a ghost because a promise was the only currency they respected. She didn't say thank you. The words were too small. Instead, she swung her leg over the Sportster, settled onto the rebuilt seat, wrapped her hands around the grips, the same grips her father's hands had held, and felt the engine vibrate through her palms and up her arms and into her chest where it synchronized with her heartbeat. She looked at Judd. He nodded, and she pulled out of the driveway and onto the road and opened the throttle. The Harley surged forward. The wind hit her face and the sun was hot on her arms, and the road stretched ahead flat and straight and infinite. She felt it, what he'd described in the tape, not running, not escaping, moving towards something. The mechanical heartbeat beneath her answering a question she hadn't known she was asking. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are not a file number or a case to close or a problem to move along. You are the daughter of a man who carved your initials into steel and trusted strangers to find you and built this machine with his own hands so that one day on a road in Nevada you would feel what freedom actually means. She rode for an hour, then two, then she turned around and came back. Because for the first time coming back didn't feel like retreat, it felt like choice. That night Lyle Crandall came for the last time, but this time was different. This time Briar was ready. She was in the garage alone at 2 in the morning, sitting on the restored Harley in the dark, running her fingers over the engravings the way her father must have done the night before he disappeared. The chrome was warm from the day's sun, still holding heat the way good metal does. The garage smelled like fresh oil and clean solvent in the particular scent of a machine that has been brought back to life by hands that cared about every bolt. She heard the engine first, then the tires on the dirt road, then silence, then footsteps. She didn't freeze this time, didn't feel the old panic surge through her nervous system. Instead, she did something she had never done in 18 years of responding to threats. She picked up her phone and made a call. Judd answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting, as if he'd known. "He's here," she said. "How many?" "Sounds like 4, 2 vehicles." "We're 12 minutes out. Lock the door and wait." "No, come when you can, but I'm handling this." Silence on the line. She could hear Judd's breathing change, heard the moment he understood that she wasn't asking permission. "Briar. 12 minutes. I'll be here when you arrive." She hung up. But she didn't go outside, not yet. Not the way she had last time, stepping between Lyle and the door, making herself a wall. That was the old reflex. The foster kid's reflex. Stand in front of the thing you are protecting and hope the bigger person flinches first. This time she did something different. She opened the garage door from the inside, rolled it all the way up, turned on the overhead light, and sat back down on the Harley with her hands resting on the tank, the engravings under her palms, and waited. The light spilled out onto the gravel like an invitation, and Lyle Crandall, who had been approaching in the dark with 3 men behind him, stopped at the edge of the light and stared. The bike was visible, fully restored, chrome gleaming under the fluorescent tubes. Tank flat, black, and perfect. Engine rebuilt. Every cable, every gasket, every piece of hardware replaced and reassembled with the care of men who understood what they were building and who they were building it for. Lyle stood at the edge of the light for a long time. His men waited behind him. The desert was silent around them, the kind of silence that amplifies everything. The creak of a leather jacket, the sound of a man's breathing changing as he looks at something he's been chasing for 19 years and sees it whole for the first time. Then he walked in. Briar didn't stand up, didn't block him. She sat on the Harley and watched him come. He moved past her as if she weren't there, went straight to the bike. His eyes scanned the frame, the tank, the handlebars. His hands reached for the right grip and twisted orient. It came off smoothly. He looked inside the handlebar tube. Empty. He dropped the grip on the floor, moved to the tank, ran his fingers along the seams looking for a compartment, a hidden panel, a welded-over cavity. Found nothing, knelt beside the frame, checked the down tubes, the back cone, the swing arm. Nothing, nothing, nothing. He stood up, looked at the engine, the rebuilt pristine engine that held no secrets inside its cylinders, no treasure behind its timing cover, no fortune stuffed into its crankcase. Just oil and metal and the mechanical precision of men who had rebuilt it with love and expertise and nothing to hide. Briar watched him search, watched him dismantle his own mythology piece by piece as his hands found empty tube after empty tube, clean joint after clean joint. Watched the 19-year story he'd been telling himself collapse in real time, not with a bang, but with the quiet clicking of hollow metal and the absence of anything inside it. Lyle straightened, his hands hung at his sides, and for the first time Briar saw his face without the mask, without the hatchet-sharp calculation, without the predatory smile, without the efficient menace that had defined every encounter. What was underneath was worse than any threat he'd ever made. He looked empty, not angry, not dangerous, hollow, like a man who has been running a marathon for 19 years and has just discovered that the finish line was painted on a wall, that there was never a door behind it, that the race was the only thing he had, and now it was over, and what remained was a 65-year-old man standing in a garage in the middle of the Nevada desert at 2 in the morning with nothing to show for 2 decades of obsession except the sound of his own breathing in an empty room. "There's nothing here," he said. His voice was different, quieter, stripped of the soft menace, stripped of everything except the raw sound of a man confronting a truth he'd been running from longer than Briar had been alive. "No," Briar said. She hadn't moved from the Harley. Her hands were still on the tank. Her voice was steady. "There's nothing here that you want. There never was." He took the ledgers. He took the money. He returned the ledgers to the club before he left. Every page, every dollar. Nola was there. Judd was there. The only thing he took was himself, and he did that because of you. Lyle stared at her. His jaw worked. The muscles in his face shifted through expressions like a man flipping through channels, looking for one that made sense and finding static on every frequency. 19 years, he said. The words came out like something he was tasting for the first time and finding rotten. 19 years chasing a ghost, Briar said. And the only thing he left in this bike was a video of himself singing to a baby. That's it. That's what you've been hunting. A father's lullaby in a USB drive. No money, no ledgers, no treasure. She looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, with something closer to recognition. She understood obsession. She understood the stories people tell themselves to survive. She had spent 18 years telling herself that she didn't need anyone, that invisibility was freedom, that the absence of love was a kind of armor. And she'd been wrong, just as Lyle had been wrong. Different lies, different costs, but the same fundamental error. Believing that the story you need to hear is the same as the truth. He didn't hide money in this bike, she said. He hid love, and you can't steal that. The garage was silent. Lyle's 3 men stood at the entrance, uncertain, looking at their boss the way employees look at a CEO who has just walked into a glass door, not knowing whether to help or pretend it didn't happen. Engines, distant, growing closer. The synchronized rumble of Harleys approaching from the east. Headlights appeared on the dirt road, cutting through the darkness like a procession of low-slung stars. Judd arrived in 9 minutes. The bikes rolled in and formed a half circle outside the garage. Men dismounted, out direction. Vests creaked, boots crunched gravel. But they didn't form a line this time. They didn't need to. The confrontation was already over. Not because force had been applied, but because the thing Lyle had come for didn't exist, had never existed. The only thing in the bike was exactly what Callum Merritt had intended to leave there. Not a fortune, a future. Judd walked into the garage, looked at Lyle, looked at Briar still sitting on the Harley, calm, unhurt, unchanged, and he understood what had happened without needing to be told. "Some bikes carry more weight than metal," Judd said. His voice was low, not threatening, almost tired. The weariness of a man who has carried this sentence for 19 years and is finally setting it down. "You never understood that." Lyle looked at Judd, looked at the men behind him, looked at Briar on the motorcycle her father had built for her, wearing the vest that said Ghost Daughter, with her hands on the tank where her father's initials were carved into the steel. And whatever was left in him that might have fought whatever thin thread of the old story might have held, snapped. He walked out of the garage, past the line of men, past the motorcycles. His 3 men followed. They got into the truck and the van, and the engines started, and the headlights came on, and for the first time Lyle Crandall drove away with his headlights on, as if he no longer cared who saw him leaving, as if the thing that had required darkness no longer existed. The tail lights shrank down the dirt road, red dots growing smaller and smaller until they were indistinguishable from the stars on the horizon, and then they were gone, not swallowed by the dark, just gone, the way things go when they're finally irreversibly over. Judd put his hand on Briar's shoulder, the second time he'd touched her. His palm rested on the leather of the vest, on the word Briar stitched in white thread, and she felt the weight of it travel down through her body and into the ground beneath her feet, and through the ground into the earth itself, into the bedrock of a state where a man had once built a motorcycle for a daughter he was about to lose, trusting that the machine would outlast his absence and find her when the time was right. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. 6 months passed. The Harley accumulated miles the way rivers accumulate stones, slowly, naturally, each one leaving its mark without damaging the whole. Briar rode through Nevada and into Arizona, and through the corners of Utah, where the rock is red and the sky is so big, it makes you feel like a punctuation mark in a sentence written by God. She worked on the bike herself now, changed the oil in gas station parking lots, adjusted the chain tension by feel. Listened to the engine the way Colt had taught her, the way Ghost had taught Colt, the way knowledge passes from hand to hand across generations like a flame that refuses to go out. She carried the cassette tape in the inside pocket of her vest. She didn't play it often. Didn't need to. The words were in her now, part of her vocabulary, part of the architecture of who she was becoming. She called Judd every Sunday. He never said much. Neither did she. But the calls lasted longer each week, not because they had more to say, because the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of people who have stood on opposite sides of the same door in the same rainstorm and decided without speaking that the door would always be open from now on. She got a job at a motorcycle shop in Flagstaff. Not under the table this time, with paperwork, with a name tag, with a boss who paid her on Fridays and asked her how her weekend was on Mondays and remembered her name without being reminded. She rented an apartment above the shop. Small, one room, but it had a window that faced east, and every morning the Arizona sun came through it and landed on the floor in a rectangle of gold that moved across the room as the hours passed like a clock made of light. She unpacked her bag all the way, put her clothes in the dresser drawers, taped the photograph from the storage unit to the wall above her bed, the one where Callum was smiling, the only one. On a Tuesday in October, she pulled into a gas station outside Flagstaff. Late afternoon, the kind of light that turns everything gold and makes even the ugliest parking lot look like a painting. She filled the tank, paid cash, walked inside for water, and when she came back out, she saw the girl, 17, maybe younger, sitting on the curb by the air pump with a duffel bag between her feet and a look on her face that Briar recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting. The girl was counting coins in her palm, moving them from one hand to the other, sorting pennies from dimes, trying to figure out if she had enough for a sandwich or if today was another day she'd skip the meal and pretend she wasn't hungry. Her hair was unwashed. Her shoes were too big. Her eyes had that hollow, distant quality that comes from learning at a young age that hope is a luxury and expectations are a trap. She wasn't crying. Girls like her didn't cry in public. They saved it for the dark, for the back seats of cars, for the bathrooms of gas stations where no one knocked because no one knew they were there. Briar stood by the Harley with her helmet in one hand and watched the girl count her coins. And she felt the tape playing in her chest. Not the words, the feeling. The feeling of being invisible in a world that only notices you when you're in the way. She walked over, didn't plan it, didn't rehearse it, the way you don't rehearse breathing. You need a place to stay. The girl looked up, suspicious, guarded, calculating the angle. Every foster kid knows the angles. Every kid who's been shuffled through the system has a radar for adults who want something, and this girl's radar was running at full power. "I'm fine," the girl said. "I know you are," Briar said. "That's not what I asked." The girl studied her, studied the vest, the bike, the grease under Briar's fingernails, and the calluses on her palms, and the way she stood. Not looming, not pitying, just present, standing in the same space as another human being and not asking for anything in return. "Why?" the girl asked. The word came out hard, defensive, a weapon disguised as a question. Briar sat down on the curb beside her, set her helmet on the concrete between her boots, looked out at the parking lot where the Harley sat in the golden light, its engine ticking as it cooled its tank, gleaming flat black with the ghost of engraved initials showing through the paint. "Because someone did it for me," she said, "and now I'm doing it for you." She took the girl to the diner across the street, bought her a meal, didn't ask questions, didn't push, just sat across the booth and ate her own food and let the girl decide how much silence she needed and how much company she could stand. The girl ate like someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days, which she probably hadn't. She finished the burger and the fries and half of Briar's fries, and then sat back with her hands wrapped around a glass of water and her shoulders slowly, gradually 1 millimeter at a time, lowering from the position they'd been locked in since Briar first saw her. "Who are you?" the girl asked. Briar looked at her. At this girl who was 18 months younger and 1,000 miles from wherever she'd started, and completely, utterly alone in the way that only people who've been inside the system understand. Alone not because no one was physically present, alone because no one was emotionally invested in whether she made it through the day. And Briar smiled, a real one. The kind she'd learned in a garage in Washoe Valley, surrounded by men with tattoos and leather vests who got on their knees to teach her how to gap spark plugs. The kind that comes from knowing where you come from and choosing where you're going. Invisible doesn't mean gone, she said. The girl frowned, confused. But something in the words landed somewhere below the confusion, in the place where the body stores things the mind hasn't processed yet. The place where truth lives before it becomes understanding. Briar left a 20 on the table for the waitress, walked the girl outside, showed her the Harley. Told her about a man named Callum Merritt who built a motorcycle for a daughter he'd never watched grow up. Told her about a man named Judd Harlan who stood in the rain all night because a promise is only worth the discomfort you're willing to endure to keep it. Told her about a rusted bike bought for $55 by a girl who thought she was buying junk and discovered she was inheriting a family. The girl listened, and somewhere during the telling, her hands stopped gripping the water glass. Her shoulders dropped another inch, her eyes changed, not from hollow to full, from closed to cracked open, just barely, just enough to let a sliver of something in. Briar reached into her vest pocket, pulled out a card with a phone number written on it. Not Briar's number, Judd's. Because some things require the kind of permanence that an 18-year-old on a motorcycle can't provide. The kind that only comes from a man who has been standing in one place for 19 years and has no intention of moving. Call when you're ready, Briar said. Or don't. Either way, someone will answer. She put on her helmet, swung her leg over the Sportster, kicked the engine to life, and felt it settle into that rhythm, that heartbeat, that sound she had chased along highways since she was 14 years old, never knowing she was chasing the echo of a machine her father had built with her name carved into its bones. She pulled out of the parking lot. The girl watched her go, watched the Harley merge onto the highway and accelerate and shrink and disappear into the Arizona gold. And she looked down at the card in her hand, at the phone number written in neat, careful handwriting. And she held it the way a person holds something they're not ready to use but are no longer willing to throw away. The Sportster's engine hummed beneath Briar as the miles unrolled. The sun was setting behind her, and the road ahead was long and empty and full of the kind of silence that isn't absence but invitation. She didn't know where she was going. Didn't need to. The machine beneath her knew the same way it had always known, the same way her father had known when he engraved his initials into the tank and trusted the future to deliver his daughter to a place where she would understand. Some families aren't born. They're built. One bolt at a time, one rainstorm at a time, one locked door opened at dawn at a time, one choice at a time.